Last November, a country with a long, complicated history with the U.S. held its presidential election. Its president was seeking a fourth consecutive term and made sure nothing stood in his way. He changed the country's laws, silenced the media, and locked up candidates who planned to run against him. As we first reported last October, Nicaragua's Daniel Ortega is not the fatigue-wearing revolutionary that you may remember. He's now 76 and rarely seen. Still, many Nicaraguans fear he is more dangerous than he's ever been. And tonight, you'll hear from two women whose husbands were planning to challenge Ortega for the presidency. Both men were arrested by the regime more than a year ago, and their wives haven't seen or spoken to them since. Now, the women are fighting to bring back their husbands and a democracy lost.
The story will continue in a moment.
If
you're seeing this, I've been captured. Those were the chilling words of Juan Sebastian Chamorro hours before he was taken from his home by mass police officers in June 2021.
8 police patrols were coming. There was a lot of cars, a lot of noise, a lot of people jumping in our walls.
Victoria Cardenas is Juan Sebastian Chamorro's wife. Chamorro was planning to run for president against Daniel Ortega and was considered a leading candidate. Because of that, Cardenas says, police had been harassing him outside of their home for months. But on June 8th, they came in.
He was on the floor with his hands up, saying, "I am here, please don't do anything to my wife." We are unarmed, and they jumped the walls, they broke in, and they took him violently.
Cardenas hasn't seen or spoken to him since. Juan Sebastian Chamorro, a Georgetown-educated economist, is part of a prominent political family in Nicaragua. Days earlier, his cousin, Cristiana Chamorro, who, coincidentally, was also running for president, was about to hold a press conference outside her home when police in riot gear showed up. You can see police push the crowd back. Chamorro was placed under house arrest. Over the next 2 months, Nicaragua's police force detained dozens of critics of the regime, journalists, and ultimately 7 of the leading candidates who plan to run for president against Ortega. Jose Miguel Vivanco was a director for Human Rights Watch, a nonprofit advocacy group that's been reporting from inside Nicaragua for decades. A lot of dictators will at least go through the motions of pretending there's a legitimate election. He's not.
Ortega's deliberate and flagrant crackdown against peaceful opposition leaders is something without any precedent in Latin America since the 70s and 80s, when most of the region was under military dictatorship.
What makes it unprecedented?
Since Ortega controls Congress, he managed to pass legislation at the end of last year that sanctioned as treason essentially any criticism of the government.
So if you criticize the government, you can be thrown in jail right now.
The language that they use is any damage to the superior interests of the nation.
It sounds Orwellian.
Orwellian. It's completely Orwellian.
Last June, Secretary of State Antony Blinken called for President Ortega to immediately release the candidates and announce sanctions against members of Ortega's family and inner circle. Until a few years ago, it might have looked like Daniel Ortega had mellowed out with age. A far cry from the revolutionary President Carter invited to the White House in 1979. Ortega's Sandinista guerrillas were credited with bringing down the Somoza family dictatorship in Nicaragua. Later, they fought off the U.S.-sponsored Contras. In 1984, Daniel Ortega was elected president and later sat down with our Mike Wallace. Ortega was voted out of office in 1990, but returned to power in 2006, promising to fight corruption. Instead, he tightened his grip on the country, first changing the Constitution so he could serve more terms, then making his wife, Rosario Murillo, an eccentric New Age poet, his vice president. Their children also hold key positions in Nicaragua. 8 of the couple's 9 children were made presidential advisors. They oversee a lucrative oil distribution business and most of the country's TV channels. But even as the Ortega family's wealth has exploded, Nicaragua remains the second poorest country in the Western Hemisphere. In 2018, Nicaraguans revolted. Thousands took to the streets to protest Ortega's proposed cuts to Social Security for senior citizens. Soon, protesters were calling for Ortega and his wife to step down. Jose Miguel Vivanco says it was a turning point for the country.
That demonstration was confronted with brutal force by Ortega.
Thousands of people were injured, more than 700 were arrested, and at least 350 people were killed by police or paramilitary groups supported by the Nicaraguan government.
All of those crimes, all of those atrocities committed by Ortega and his security forces just a couple of years ago, he was able to get away with those crimes.
But Vivanco says Ortega also realized that if he lost power, he might be imprisoned for what Nicaraguan journalists called a massacre of protesters.
Very few people around the world doubt that Nicaragua is a dictatorship.
Felix Maradiaga, a former cabinet member, was one of Ortega's most outspoken critics. A graduate of Harvard, he addressed world leaders at the Geneva Summit for Human Rights and Democracy in 2019.
I come here with the conviction and hope that the world will continue to support the struggle of my people to build a free and open society.
Felix Maradiaga was teaching nonviolent activism to Nicaraguan students when witnesses say he was beaten by Ortega's henchmen in 2018. After this attack, Maradiaga was hospitalized. For the next few years, he was under constant surveillance by the police, according to his wife, Berta Valle.
They watch him, they put patrols in front of his house. The police would tell him that he was not able to go out of the house. And from December 2020 to February 21, he was under house arrest.
So no warrant, but he's not allowed to leave the house.
Exactly.
Even so, Felix Maradiaga decided he would run for president, one of a group of opposition candidates who, for the first time, had decided to band together to try to defeat Daniel Ortega.
They signed a document saying that they were willing to support the one that could represent the Nicaraguan people.
But the opposition never got the chance to put their candidate forward. Most were arrested or fled the country before they could file the paperwork to officially put them on the ballot. On June 8, 2021, Felix Maradiaga was summoned to meet with government prosecutors. His family feared he would be arrested during the meeting.
So he went with a lawyer, a friend, and he was interviewed for 4 hours.
So Felix came out, he talked to the independent
Exactly.
press.
We were watching this live, and we said, oh, thanks God, he came out, he's okay, he's going to take the car, and he's going to leave.
His attorney says they were driving away when Maradiaga was dragged out of the car and beaten by police. His wife hasn't seen him since that morning in June.
Feliz cumpleaños, mi amor.
It turns out Maradiaga knew he was in danger. Hours before his arrest, he left his daughter, Alejandra, a series of videos so she would hear his voice in case he wasn't there for her 8th birthday. I'm thinking of you on your birthday, he says, and tells her, I love you. She and her mother have been living in the United States for 3 years because of threats at home and are now applying for asylum. We concealed Alejandra's identity for her safety.
I want to go see my dog, my family. I have a cat and a dog.
In August, we met Berta Valle and Victoria Cardenas in Washington, where they'd been petitioning U.S. lawmakers to help free their husbands and about 150 other political prisoners in Nicaragua.
And we're demanding justice.
At that point, the men had disappeared. No one had heard from them or seen them in 2 months.
Do you believe that he's still alive?
That's what I want to believe. You know, we have the hope that he's okay, but we don't know. And that's why we are asking for a proof of life to this point. And this is why we are doing all this effort to come out and to go to the international community, because there's nothing we can do in Nicaragua.
Last September, 87 days after their arrests, attorneys for Felix Maradiaga and Juan Sebastian Chamorro were allowed to briefly see them at El Chipote, the Nicaraguan prison that's been described by human rights workers as a dungeon. Both men were charged with, quote, conspiracy to undermine the national integrity at a closed hearing in the jail. Attorneys say both Chamorro and Maradiaga have lost significant weight and been subjected to months of interrogations and psychological torture.
It's a violation of the basic human rights. It's not only my family who is suffering, it's more than 140 families who have political prisoners who are innocent and are living this awful situation.
Victoria Cardenas and Berta Valle cannot go back to Nicaragua. Because of their appeals for help to Washington and the international community, the women have been charged in absentia with being traitors to the homeland.
So what would happen if you went back to Nicaragua now? Would you be arrested?
Definitely, yes. Not only arrested, but if they condemn me, that would be life prison.
The violence in Nicaragua is fueling an exodus. Tens of thousands of Nicaraguans have fled to Costa Rica, and U.S. Customs and Border Protection says about 38,000 Nicaraguans reached the U.S. border last summer, compared to less than 800 people over the same time the year before. In August, the State Department announced more sanctions against members of the Ortega regime. But at the same time, the International Monetary Fund approved sending more than $350 million to Nicaragua. It's supposed to help fight hunger and COVID.
What do you think they're going to give that money to? Just to put these people in jail and torture them even more?
In September, members of Congress from both parties demanded the IMF reconsider sending more money to Nicaragua.
This is just not acceptable.
And called for stronger sanctions against Ortega. The Pentagon has also warned Congress that Russia has been supplying Nicaragua with millions of dollars in military equipment and training, and that Ortega has allowed Russia to build a listening station so close to the U.S.
Haven't we heard this story before? This all sounds very familiar.
It is. Going back 35 years to the middle of the Cold War. That is unfortunately the scenario where we are operating, we are living now.
Jose Miguel Vivanco says with Russia's continued military and financial support, U.S. sanctions will not be enough to convince Daniel Ortega to change course.
Ortega has decided to stay in power for the rest of his life.
Since our story first aired, Felix Maradiaga and Juan Sebastian Chamorro were tried by the Ortega regime inside the El Chipote prison. They were each sentenced to 13 years in what has been widely criticized as a sham trial.